on the left, we thought this is a good symbol for our work and who we are not. On the left, you see a very, very famous romantic oil painting from Germany by Karl Spitzweg, and it's called The Poor Poet. And we would like to point out that we are not poor poets. We are academics. We work, I just retired, but our home institution is Wake Forest University. I have been in religious studies. My colleague Grant is a professor of German literature. And one of our great joys of collaborating is speaking German every so often with each other. And our work is also related to that photo because when you look at the right, you see a photograph taken after the Second World War. And it says it's a student who is reading the paper in an apartment in Berlin that has been partially demolished by bombs. So, you know, it reminds us of Ukraine. But because the Spitzweg painting is so famous, the photographer had some fun of evoking the key symbols. The roof is leaking, the ceiling is leaking, so you have an umbrella over your bed. The heat is not working, so you huddle under the blankets on your bed, obviously because of war. You have the bucket in which the water drops, and clearly both are involved in intellectual work. The poet is writing a poem on the left in Karl Spitzweg's painting, and the student on the right is reading news. And so, how does that relate to our work? We are delving deep into the past, a well-made, complex world. And like the photographer in the right painting, we will never get the past right. It's an ongoing project. We will never be able to translate directly all the elements from Karl Spitzweg's painting into a modern version. And so that teaches us as scholars humility. We know that our investigations will always be incomplete. It's an ongoing journey. And as my colleague will talk about, there are always silences from the past that are very hard to penetrate. And so with that kind of invocation of humility, I invite you to conversation with us about the choices the Moravian community made about how to become American. And it was always many, many choices, some more difficult than others. Next slide, please. So we want to start out with a definition of the key terms, and that is, what do we mean by becoming American? Why did we choose the year 1772 till 1822? And since we were interested in the relationship between Moravians and other emergent Americans, we looked into the concept of the neighbor. And so I will start with defining the term American, and then my colleague will take it from there. And then for the remainder of our time together, can talk to each other, and we will also walk you through the book chapters as a whole and give you brief summaries so that by the end of our time together, you have a pretty good sense of what our work generated in this very creative engagement with each other. Popular definitions of the early republic tout its spirit of democracy, technological innovation, the rapid growth of economic and legal infrastructures, and territorial expansion. In a 1932 study of the place of the northern province in this process, the historian Marie Konova framed the question of Moravian Americanization in terms of material adaptation to the environment, mental adaptation to the environment, and self-identification as Americans. Konova proposed that the Moravians were comparatively slow in becoming American precisely due to their overarching focus on their mission work to Native peoples. Moving into the 21st century, defining the meaning of being American appears to have become a contingent, contested, and provisional process. To cite one example in the contemporary moment, the New York Times 1619 Project exemplifies the fundamentally open nature of any effort to define who and what constitutes the United States. In making a case for the foundational role of racial slavery in building the nation, the 1619 Project's authors contend that, quote, out of slavery and the anti-Black racism it required grew nearly everything that has truly made America exceptional. Its economic might, its industrial power, its electoral system, its diet, its popular music, the inequities of its public health and education, its astonishing penchant for violence, its income inequality, the example it sets for the world as a land of freedom and equality, its slang, its legal system, and the endemic racial fears and hatreds that continue to plague it to this day. The seeds of all that were planted long before our official birth date in 1776, when the men known as our founders formally declared independence from Britain. End of quote. While newer definitions stress the race-based economic and cultural dimensions of Americanization, including the illegal annexation of indigenous homelands and the removal of its rightful indigenous owners, governmental definitions have emphasized American democratic principles. And this is the third type of definition of what it means to become American. The governmental definitions have emphasized American democratic principles as the gold standard for Americanization, which need to be taught in schools. For example, in 1997, the U.S. Commission on Immigration Reform explicitly linked immigration, civic education, and American values, stating that through civic education, quote, immigrants become part of our communities, and by which our communities and the nation learn from and adapt to their presence. Americanization means a civic incorporation of immigrants that is a cultivation of a shared commitment to the American values of liberty, democracy, and equal opportunity. End of quote. As we shall see, the contributors to our volume drew from all three types of definition to one degree or another, exploring Moravian material culture, new mentalities and processes of self-identification, delineating racialized and gendered social realities, and mapping changes in Moravian civic engagement. So this is really a lot, and it's a very, very deep and profound matter to engage in. So,
hello, everyone. I'm going to talk about why we picked these years, 1772 through 1822. First of all, 50 years is a good amount of time. It presents roughly 2-3 generations of time. And in particular, this period in Moravian history also spans a developmental period in American history that is really profound. It's the time when we declared our independence, the federal period, and the time of the early republic. And how all these changes influenced all of the inhabitants in what was to become the United States. So why 1772 through 1822? This period spans the years of colonialism, the Revolutionary War, and the early republic. It is a period rife with early definitions of American identities. Within this ethnically fraught nexus of emergent identities, strict divisions between race and color become the most identifiable aspect of Americanism. Moravians began to outgrow their communal European roots as internal and and external pressures urged them to conform to the white individualistic American archetype that was blossoming following the Revolutionary War. It is in this post-war landscape of new national identities that the Moravians began to refer to the United States not as their host country, but rather as their quote-unquote fatherland. The years 1772 through 1822 are not randomly chosen. 1772 marked the 50th anniversary of Moravian refugees seeking sanctuary at Count Zinzendorf's estate in Saxony. Also in 1772, Salem became a fully operational Ortsgemeine, or theocratic congregation. Even though 1766 is the official founding date of Salem, and its Gemeinhaus was consecrated in 1771, it was not until 1772 that the chief minister, Frederick William Marshall, moved to Salem. His official inauguration was followed by the arrival of the Single Sisters and the election of the central governing bodies, including the Ältestenkonferenz. So in 1772, that's really when Salem got up and started functioning as a congregation. 50 years later, in Salem, in 1822, the first exclusively Black congregation was founded with a white minister at its helm. This momentous event signifies a turning point in Southern Moravian race relations. The initial goal of early Moravian mission work envisioned a veritable society of Philadelphian pilgrims evangelizing around the globe. As early as the 1730s, Moravians built mission stations to convert Indigenous and Black populations. At the time, they incorporated converts into their congregations, had integrated services, and supported even interracial marriages. However, in Salem, this supranational vision and nominal racial integration waned as white Southern Moravians began to adopt new attitudes about nationality, trade, commercialism, and slavery. Importantly, these new attitudes also included new racialized identities that demanded segregation. Lines separating neighbors based not on linguistic, national, or religious affiliation, but on color followed suit. So what do we mean when we talk about neighbors? In our study, we focus on the interplay between Moravians and their neighbors and the shifting discourses of cooperation or maybe even subjugation and domination. These are the things that defined Wachovia's politics at the time. Our project therefore strives to also ask who and what constituted, in particular, a Moravian neighbor. In searching for a suitable tract of land for a new congregation in the South, Bishop August Gottlieb Spangenberg was asked to make inquiries of the, quote, nearest neighbors to the spot to be taken up, end quote. Who precisely these early Southern neighbors were remains unknown, or largely unknown. However, the Moravians would have expected to live among long-established indigenous nations such as the Catawba, the Cherokee, and the Tuscarora. European settlers such as the Irish, Scots, English, and Germans also resided in the area, and most certainly they came across enslaved or free Black Africans. In early archival records, Moravians refer to all three groups collectively as neighbors, or Nachbarn, or as strangers, Fremde. Rarely do they mention race or national identity. At times, neighbor implied more or less a friendly relationship. However, elsewhere in the records, there is definitely evidence that neighborly relations were not always friendly. This ambiguity creates considerable uncertainty about the social political agency and identity of the first Moravian neighbors. At its most basic etymological level, in both German and English, neighbor or Nachbar is a contraction of near, nahe, and Boer, Bar, or Bauer, which is a farmer. The term means the person who works the land nearest you. In the Bible, the Hebrew and the Greek word for neighbor convey differences that illustrate a complex epistemology surrounding the term. While the Hebrew word for neighbor signifies friend or acquaintance, the Greek word suggests proximity, much like the English and German. Therefore, in the Gospel according to Luke 10:27, when the expert in the law hears the commandment, quote, to love thy neighbor, end quote, the lawyer then asks again, quote, but who is my neighbor, end quote. The political and ethical implications of the neighbor are revealed in this statement.
Is our neighbor a friend or merely an other who occupies a shared space? What kind of expectations regarding cooperation does this relationship demand? Questions such as these frame the space Southern Moravians and their surrounding neighbors negotiated. Interpreting this tangled interplay of cultures and political discourses is the challenge that underpins our collection of essays. And I'd like to end this discussion by including a short anecdote that helps provide an example of who the Moravians were in the early years and who they became a few generations later. On July 23rd, 1730, in a congregational meeting at Herrnhut in Saxony, Johann Leonard Dober listened to Count Zinzendorf relate a story about the quote-unquote wretched state of enslaved Black Africans in the West Indies. Upon hearing the story, he promptly decided to, quote, offer himself as a missionary, end quote, and to live among the enslaved. Roughly 100 years later, in 1832, Salem-born Henry Leinbach bemoaned the intense discomfort of sharing space with a Black individual on a train to Newark, New Jersey. Quote, when I came to the stage, the seats were all occupied but one, which I had to take, on the middle seat, and fronting me sat an African in full glory, staring me right in the face and entangling his black legs in mine, rather disagreeable to a Southern man. The first narrative reflects the early Moravian ambition of bringing the gospel to all peoples, irrespective of ethnicity, social standing, and nationality. The Moravian spiritual leader and founder of the renewed unity of brethren, Count Zinzendorf, envisioned a worldwide empire of God, a Gottesreich, that transcended political borders, claiming, quote, the entire world is the prophet's parish, end quote. The second narrative calls the foundational myth of the first narrative, Zinzendorf's narrative, into question. It presents a determined assertion of American national identity, individuality, and racial segregation, the antithesis of Johann Dober's religious conviction in 1730. Both statements come from leading Moravians divided by 2 centuries and continents, or 2 different centuries and 2 different continents. Johann Dober was a charter member of the renewed unity of the brethren in Herrnhut, and Henry Leinbach was an influential figure of Salem's congregation between 1830 and 1860. Viewed together, brothers Dober and Leinbach provide a barometer that measures the Moravians' shifting attitudes about nationality, race, religion, and self-identity, particularly in the American South. As subsequent generations of North Carolinian Moravians, like Henry Leinbach, became American, they developed an allegiance to their host nation and embraced the economic, political, and racial hierarchies that stitched that specific American social fabric together. Leinbach's statement provides crucial information about the contours of this American identity. So let's look closely at a statement. He is individualistic. He regrets having to occupy the middle seat surrounded by others. He'd rather be alone. And he is politically partisan. He's not only American, but he specifically states he's a Southern American. And in addition, he's also a segregation. The offensive entanglement of his neighbor's black legs with his is the core of his complaint. Leinbach's statement is a testament to the shifting identities within his Salem community. As a self-avowed Southern American, Henry Leinbach illustrates how by 1822, Moravians mirrored Southern American definitions of family, gender, private property, economics, and their embrace of slavery and the attendant racial attitudes.
Next slide. So we want to pause here, and as we talked with Rebecca how to organize this experience, we thought we would break up in between chunks to give you all an opportunity to reflect how you relate to this research agenda. So our suggested discussion question for you this morning is, so how would you define Americanization and neighbor today? as you look back. It's the way we have looked back for the last 4 years. And what has changed and what has remained the same as one thinks about these processes. So we invite you to take a neighbor, the person to your left, and just take 5 minutes and reflect on, to your right, yes, exactly, to your right, and reflect on where you stand on that. And then we'll just talk to each other a little bit and then come back and move on with the chapters and share where you are with this idea. So please take a neighbor and take a few minutes to talk about these ideas. Honor our schedule. Next slide, please. So, as our research developed and we put our book together, we decided to create 4 broad categories, and these could be different. The research overlaps all 4 categories, but the categories are, and we walk you through that, foundations. The Moravians were not a blank sheet on which American history wrote itself. They brought a lot of really powerful legacies with them from Europe. Our second big pot in which we sorted our research was named convergences, because we can clearly identify how Moravians made the choice to converge with the larger movements at the time. Our third category is that of innovation. Moravians were never passive. Moravians also very actively and very, very creatively made contributions to an emergent United States. And then our fourth category, which we felt the research made very clear, honing back on the Southern experience, and that is segregation. And in that section, we show different dynamics, how that played itself out between the years of 1772 and 1822. And then we'll close our presentation with where we might want to go from here. So next slide, please. Thank you.
Okay, so I will summarize this first chapter, and this is the first chapter's author is Craig Atwood.
And the title of his essay is The American Plan of Zinzendorf and Spangenberg. And so we have an image here with Spangenberg on the right and Zinzendorf on the left. And the quote that I added here is kind of a title of this piece is Moravian Communalism, Ecumenism, and egalitarianism represented a threat to the established order in Europe and America. Okay, so Craig highlights how Count Zinzendorf and Bishop August Gottlieb Spangenberg shaped Wachovia's early founding. Atwood argues that Wachovia's layout, economic communalism, and social and familiar structures, including even sexual practices, were directed by Spangenberg's implementation of Zinzendorf's and his own theological vision. Surprisingly, his teachings and attitudes about gender, communal practices, and integrated worship between white and black church members scandalized Anglo-American conceptions of decorum and morality. Unlike the bishop's controversial religious guidance, under the bishop's controversial religious guidance, Bethlehem's and Wachovia's character differed greatly not only from other European settlements, but also from other Moravian communities. For example, his implementation of the general economy created a social, economic, communal life that directly undermined the traditional patriarchal structure of Anglo-American cultures. While the intention was to establish a theocratic utopia with Salem as a new Jerusalem, Spangenberg's plan failed to materialize. The Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars and persistent financial troubles curtailed Spangenberg's religious vision. Following 1783, the end of the Revolutionary War, Salem's younger generations became increasingly interested in economic prosperity and adopting their white American neighbors' custom and mores. So it's really interesting that at the beginning, the general economy, the communalism, definitions of sexual practices, even gender, the involvement of females functioning at high levels within the church was something that confronted the traditions and the customs of the Anglo-American settlers that were here when the Moravians came. Next slide, please. The next author is Larry Ties, a historian, and he talks about the difficulties of bringing Wachovia into Moravian ownership and getting the deed officially listed as belonging to Moravians. And the quote that I have there is, Hutton secured Benjamin Franklin's assistance in transmitting Wachovia's precious deed to American soil. Complementing Craig Atwood's, one more thing. So it's kind of an interesting image here. Everything in red is Forsyth County, and then it's within, everything in red is Salem, Winston-Salem city. And then you have the box there, that's Wachovia within Forsyth County. You all recognize the borders of Forsyth County there. So it's interesting to see how Winston-Salem basically is Wachovia in general. So it has almost filled the entirety of what was this 100,000 piece of acreage. Complementing Craig Atwood's study, Larry Ties' essay, The Transformation of Wachovia from Anglican Protectorate to Moravian Preserve, provides a lively history of the political and legal structures to establish Moravian ownership of Wachovia. Ties also connects the struggle over land with the Moravians' fight for spiritual hegemony in the region. He begins with a focus on the Revolutionary War and the meetings that took place in Paris between Benjamin Franklin and James Hutton. Hutton was the Moravian representative from London who was desperately trying to secure Moravian ownership of Wachovia. Ties states that the American Revolution presented the biggest threat for the Moravian community. After the outbreak of the war, American colonies were authorized to seize property formerly held by loyalist and non-residents. Because Hutton held the deeds to Wachovia, resided in London, and purchased the land from Lord Granville, a British aristocrat, the Americans were well within their right to seize the land. Additionally, Moravian neutrality in the war gravely endangered their property claims. In engaging detail, Ties delineates how, under Benjamin Franklin's behest, Hutton transferred the deed to Salem's chief administrator and a new holder of an American passport, thanks to Franklin, Frederick William Marshall. Toward the end of the war in 1782, Marshall finally managed to convince the North Carolina Assembly to legally register his deed. So it was deeded to him, and then he registered it with the North Carolina Assembly, thus creating not only landowners out of the Moravians, but American landowners as well. The second half of his essay shifts to an analysis of the Methodist challenge to Moravian spiritual dominance in the region. Ties argues that a successful Methodist ministry just outside of Bethania and Bethabara on Daub's farm weakened Moravian spiritual influence and consequently Moravian religious culture itself. Unable to stem the flow, Moravian leaders watched helplessly as several members joined the new Methodist churches just outside of town. While Moravians managed to secure their land, they lost the struggle for evangelical dominance in the region, as the Methodist preacher offered a spiritual experience more American than the Moravian.
Next slide, please. Our next study in the section on foundation deals really what some scholars have called the imperial hub of the British Empire. And so when we think of North Carolina, we have, and look at it through British eyes, we look at North Carolina's coastline linking the British Centre in London, in the UK, and the Caribbean. And if you remember, the Moravians followed those big geographic outlines by starting their missions in Caribbean stations of European empires. And so here you have two pictures from Antigua. On the left, you see enslaved Black African, Caribbean men and women working in the fields. On the right, you see a photo from the early 20th century of students, Black students in a Moravian school in Antigua. And these two pictures identify an aspect of Renelle Curtin-Roberts' work. Dr. Curtin-Roberts is a Moravian minister from the Caribbean. She's currently ministering in Geneva. And this is what her research says. In Moravian history, the Caribbean is a starting point of Moravian evangelism. In many ways, Wachovia and other North American settlements owe their establishment and development to the experiences of the first missions to St. Thomas, Antigua, and Tobago. For the British Empire, the Caribbean region incorporated the Sugar Islands and the southeastern mainland colonies as one large empire hub. Moravian pastor Curtin-Roberts describes that through their efforts to convert enslaved people, Moravian missionaries sought to de-Africanize Black Caribbean culture, writing, I quote, "Moravians believed that African culture was inherently evil. They denounced and attempted to purge the very essence of who Black people in the Caribbean were and are," end of quote. Missionaries prohibited traditional expressions of ancestral homage and culturally based expressions of emotions such as grief and joy through rhythmic celebrations. Curtin-Roberts' research challenges the Moravian narrative of cultural neutrality to reassert the centrality of a self-defined and self-directed African, Caribbean, Moravian identity. And so if you look at the photo on the right, you see that the Black female students all wear Western clothing. Their hairstyles are very Western. And you could say, well, this is really a huge step forward compared to the horrors of working in sugar plantations. And what Renelle Curtin-Roberts proposes to you that while there is truth to that, you also see a very, very profound, deep self-alienation of Black Caribbeans from their own cultural heritage. And the self-alienation is due to the demonization and labeling African cultures as savage in a really aggressive, and Renelle Curtin-Roberts proposes for us to think about very destructive way. Next slide, please. The final essay in our work on mapping out foundations have to do with the establishment of archives. None of us would know anything about the past without the amazing work, and David is here, and we know how hard you work on protecting and understanding the archival traditions. We couldn't do our work without the archives. But those of you who know Paul's work know that for many, many years, he has, as an archivist of the northern provinces, really studied in depth how archives are being put together. And I leave you with a quote here. I've introduced you to a quote by Bishop Johannes Edwine. You might have known the name. It's from 1790, right in our time period. And it has to do with archivists coming to terms with what my colleague, Professor McAllister, pointed to earlier, the Zinzendorfian era, which turned out to be extremely controversial. And the archivists got together and decided to really get rid of all the potentially controversial materials in the archives. And so Johannes Edwein left a note, a handwritten note, and said, quote, "Whoever wants to read these diaries in the future," that would be us, "is requested to ignore exaggerated expressions from the Zinzendorfian era, such as the side hole, brown hearts, black hearts, any references to the marriage customs that my colleague already alluded to, etc. Whoever has time and desire to copy the diaries and to leave out such words and phrases will do a great service to posterity." And that would be us. End of quote. In his chapter, archivist and historian Paul Peuker problematizes the archival record of Moravian historical narratives. Peuker makes the case that church-directed processes of inclusion and exclusion created a subjective archival record, a process known as archivalization. As Peuker illustrates, the Moravian Church carefully determined which historical records, documents, and personal letters would be preserved and which would be excluded, silenced, or destroyed. Through predetermined archival selection criteria, and there you have the quote, Moravians endeavored to ensure that widespread anti-Moravian polemics would not constitute the only historical record. They controlled the production of archival holdings so that the history and the biographies of significant church leaders, such as Count Zinzendorf, were transmitted without controversy. As a consequence, American Moravians were taught a misleading Moravian history, especially so, and we will come back to that point later, in regard to feminine imagery of the divine, women's leadership, and gender inclusivity. Secondly, a stronger emphasis was placed on constructing a pre-Zinzendorfian past reaching back to Jan Hus. So we really see this pivot, according to Paul Peuker, away from Zinzendorf towards Jan Hus and the Bohemian tradition. And I think this is really powerful to think about today, where we want to go with that. Or, you know, what that says about, will the real Moravians please stand up, you know? So it's like this open-ended process, as with Americanization. Bob, the next slide, please. So this moves us into our second big pot into which we sorted our materials. And so you have, again, 4 papers. We look at music, the early performance of Haydn's creation. We look at gender in Riddick Weber's work. We look at a kind of overview with John Sensberg's work. And we go back to what my colleagues started out. So next slide, please. Taking another look at the American Revolution. Okay. So we heard already from my colleague a little bit about how, and we talked about it in our breakout group, what a terrifying period the revolutionary years were for the Moravians. I mean, it was really touch and go existentially. It could have gone the way of total destruction of a Moravian presence. And so we cannot overestimate how significant the era was. In his case study, historian John Ruddiman offers a nuanced reading of the as yet unpublished Moravian historiography of the American Revolution by the Moravian merchant and community leader Traugott Bagge, and we all know where his house is. For over 20 years, Bagge worked as Wachovia's political negotiator with the North Carolina Assembly in Hillsborough. He served as a justice of the peace and eventually was elected to the Assembly as the first Moravian to hold this office. His work as a skillful diplomat and negotiator on behalf of Moravian interests reveal the push and pull of reconciling the religious community with American political realities. In one of its greatest time of crisis, the southern province was in terrifying danger to lose its land holdings due to the Moravians' reputation as loyal British subjects. And as you pointed out, they had to thank the British for being here in the first place. Thanks to swift and thoughtful political strategies, Moravians survived and were able to keep their lands. Bagge intentionally designed his account of the revolution as a narrative pedagogy to educate Moravian readers of the lesson learned. From Bagge's perspective, Moravians had no choice but to take political sides and as a result became civically active Americans. And you will hear a little bit about that later as well. Next slide, please. And now to something completely different. Haydn's creation. Stu Carter, also at Wake Forest, and I'm sure you all know him, looked as part of our research into the scandals, and here we have a culture war right here in Salem, the scandals surrounding the Moravian performance of Haydn's creation. Music historian Stuart Carter maps another, and now we are convergence, another adaptation watershed in the cultural domain of sacred music. Instrumental and choral music has been essential to Moravian religious identity ever since Count Zinzendorf's voluminous creation of hymns, which were also, by the way, censored. A spiritual practice best known perhaps in the custom of the Moravian Singstunde. In his fascinating study, Carter makes the case that Moravian responses to the three earliest performances of Joseph Haydn's Die Schöpfung in Salem demonstrate the community's increasing secularization because, believe it or not, the creation was considered a pretty secular piece, although it brimming with religious motifs. One of the performances actually included a large public concert on Independence Day in 1829. Who knew? Staging their creation, deemed a secular composition despite its religious content, and performed already in cosmopolitan settings such as Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, was critiqued initially as a form of worldly amusement that could endanger young minds. Tellingly, and we will have more to say about young Moravians later on. Tellingly, the libretto avoids any mention of original sin and revels in depicting a very happy Adam and Eve frolicking in the Garden of Eden. A Moravian culture war ensued, and remarkably, the faction in support of the performance won out. The creation became, with great success, Salem's biggest public event since the founding of Wachovia. Its performing musicians had turned cultural avant-garde, and most came from old Moravian families. Hector Berlioz famously complained about the Schöpfung that, quote, all these conventionalities put me in such a sour mood that I would like to kill someone, end of quote. Moravians abstained from such extreme measures. Next slide, please. Okay. Redek Weber, you probably know him quite well, has done a tremendous service to Moravian history by really working on the role of women and combing through the archives and showing how ahead of the times the Moravians were. For a while, for some decades, thanks to Count Zinzendorf and the early circle. So here are a few statistics. Between 1730 and 1760, and what you have to really let those statistics sink in, 420 Moravian women served as so-called acolytae. 202 women were ordained as deacons, and 14 women served as priestesses. Between 1760 and 1786, Wachovia congregations were served by more ordained women after the Zinzendorfs died than were ordained before. All 6 of the 18th century congregations here in the Wachovia, with the probable exception of Hope, were served by at least one ordained woman. Ladies and gentlemen, that's really incredible. And of the 48 women that Moravians ordained in the United States alone, 10 of them were here right in Salem ordained. So I think that is really remarkable. So Professor of Pastoral Ministry, Ulrike Wiethaus, offers a close reading of archival records about Salem's Single Sisters Choir. Without leadership representation, I think I mixed up my sentence here. So in Salem, as I just said, at least 10 women were ordained. But what he found, as Wachovia's male leadership clamped down on women's leadership roles, and Weber noticed that at the same time as women leadership's role declined, women's resistance went up. And he found at least 10 young Moravian women, and the emphasis is here again on the younger generations. So now I think I'm back on track here with my writing. Interestingly, the choirs, the women, Single Sisters choirs, internal cohesion began to corrode at the same time that women's leadership roles were removed. Increasingly, Salem's young women chomped at the bit of communal conformity. And was it perhaps that because they lacked leadership representation? We don't know. But the question asks itself in a way. Some of their rebellious acts remain hinted at, but otherwise unnamed. Others are clearly spelled out, usually when young women opted to elope with the goal of marrying a non-Moravian spouse. Leaving their community altogether, they prefer to marry into surrounding American families and enjoy a less regimented town life. Young Moravian women took advantage of the American right to choose one's spouse and demanded for Salem's theocratic Ortsgemeine what was already common practice in a Landsgemeine such as Hope. And it was not until the Synod of 1818 that everybody was granted the free choice of a spouse. So I think that's also something to really think about. So next slide, please. So John Sensbach kind of gives us an overview, and he compares the increasing yearning of young Moravian generations to embrace American freedoms, but at the same time it was bought for with the price of enslaving African Americans. And so as individual liberties for white Moravians increased, of course, the human rights, our contemporary term, of African Americans decreased. In his chapter, historian John Sensbach offers a comparison of enslaved Black Moravians and Moravians of European descent under the rubric of U.S. concepts of freedom. The essay straddles the fence between evidence of cultural convergence among white Moravians and cultural innovations among Black Moravians to forge a new Black American identity. For white Moravians, especially second and third generations, American freedom signified the individual pursuit of wealth in agricultural settlements that were becoming increasingly independent from theocratic rule in Salem. A desire for agricultural profitability demanded the racialized labor of enslaved workers. White Moravian farmers, artisans, and entrepreneurs reformulated Moravian spiritual practices by segregating Black brothers and sisters. European descent Moravians learned to minimize their own ethnic traditions, especially those that were German. In contrast, and as a segue to part three of our work, Black Moravians denied the promise of a distinctly white American freedom, embraced and adapted a diverse African cultural heritage and African-centered religious practices. Under tremendous duress, Black Moravians forged an innovative American identity faithful to their American past and its intellectual and cultural achievements, while building intercultural Black spaces of life-giving spirituality. Next slide, please. So it's definitely a conversation with Winnell Curtin-Roberts' piece. So we are now moving into our innovative dimension of Moravian Americanization, and my colleague will take it from here.
Yeah, could you go to the next slide, please?
Okay, so I'm going to talk about Tom McCullough's essay, which is about Moravians celebrating two of the biggest holidays in the United States, Independence Day and George Washington's birthday. I have a picture here of a celebration of Independence Day. And if you can tell, I want you to take notice of the guns being fired. You have fireworks going off, and in the background, you can see a militia that's parading through this town. This isn't Salem, by the way. It's just a representation of some small town in the early 1820s. So it's kind of interesting just to see the noise. You can see the individual in the front in the red coat holding his ears from all the noise that's going on. That's a crucial part of Tom's essay here. And then on the left, we have the plaque there commemorating the celebration of Independence Day, Salem being the first region to celebrate Independence Day, 1783 on July 4th. Thomas J. McCullough's essay entitled Moravians and the Celebration of American Figures and Holidays offers a nuanced analysis of the specific ways in which white Moravians came to celebrate American national holidays. Up until the Civil War, there were only two national holidays in the United States, Independence Day and George Washington's birthday. Therefore, McCullough focuses on these two holidays, providing special attention to the 4th of July. Salem's celebration of Independence Day on July 4th, 1783, with Johann Friedrich Pater's Psalm of Joy, has been the subject of much scholarly attention and local Salem pride. However, McCullough emphasizes that this celebration was merely a response to an order given by the governor. It was not an impromptu sentiment of patriotism as one might want to conclude. In fact, Moravian congregations frequently celebrated those holidays of whatever territory they found themselves in, whether it be in England, Prussia, or the United States. Moravians could draw on well-established liturgical commemorative practices and on a religious culture of remembrance to appropriate new holidays like American Independence Day. These new Moravian holiday celebrations sacralized secular political events and built bridges to non-Moravian communities. However, Independence Day did develop differently as younger generations of Moravians began bucking tradition and defying their elders' orders. Many younger Moravians gleefully participated in Independence Day celebrations, which were loud and boisterous and included the firing of guns, a warlike attitude that the pacifist Moravian elders denounced. Bishops in Bethlehem and Salem decried the youthful participation, and even reprimanded their members. Some were even prevented from participating in Holy Communion. Yet it was a new American custom Moravian elders could not stop. By 1826, the elders gave up. They surrendered and no longer rebuked the youthful patriotism of their younger members. Independence Day eventually inserted itself next to all of the other religious holidays Moravians came to celebrate.
Next slide, please. So we have walked in Old Salem, and I think all of us love it so much, many, many times. And you know David Bergstone's tremendous work as a cultural preservation expert. And so here you have two slides that you all, buildings you have all seen many, many times. On the right, of course, German half-timbered architecture with a Küchenhaus plant, very, very Germanic looking, traditional building, replicated. And then on the left, you have our wonderful archives in what is now called a Moravian revival style. And in between those two buildings, you have an architectural history of Moravians becoming American. Architectural historian David Bergstone maps the rapid transition from traditional European to national architectural styles in Salem across just a few generations. These material changes illustrate an attitudinal shift from a relatively egalitarian theocracy to a socially stratified, individualistic community driven by a Southern slave economy. Exemplifying Moravian roots in Eastern and Central Europe, the earliest strata of architectural elements comprised clay roofs and half-timbered house constructions. Growing in size and sophistication, these early forms gave way to imposing structures in the manner of Federal and Greek revival styles. An unusual return to an earlier Moravian architectural aesthetic, perhaps as an attempt to visually assert Moravian European roots, became apparent in the earliest 20th century with the proliferation of building elements that utilize the Moravian revival designs. And this building itself has a Moravian revival style to identify itself as Moravian. So we thought that was very, very interesting to think about. So next slide, please. So this is David's paper, and David, I know you have to leave at 10:30. So next slide, please. So Jeffries, why don't we
Go back one.
Go back one, please.
There we go.
There we go. So maybe, David, you want to talk about your paper or just chip in? And shall we go ahead? But I want to make sure we cover it before you have to leave. So. Okay, so as I said earlier, David worked for our project on copybooks. And in terms of their context, now the printed music sheets at the time were extremely expensive. And it would be very, very hard to really keep up with compositions and new music sheets if there wasn't one brilliant solution, and that is creating copybooks. And so we heard probably the most famous Moravian composer, Peter, had his own copybook that Dave studied very much in depth. But then, and I found this wonderful photo of Salem student graduates in the early 20th century with a daisy chain. You would have a lot of Moravian female students, also male students, but a lot of them becoming knowledgeable about Moravian music through creating copybooks of their own. And so they found quite a few of them that were actually also indicating the owners, the women who made the copies. So this is another hidden history of Moravian women that I think is fascinating. And let me read my short summary, Dave, of your work and correct me immediately. Research librarian and musicologist David Bloom analyzes changes in music education as evidenced in the considerable collection of copybooks produced and used in Moravian schools. Music education and pedagogy was instrumental in developing pupils' aesthetic and religious identity as Moravians. In the new settlement of Salem, schools were founded, as you all know, as early as 1771 for boys and in the following year for girls. Bloom's detailed analysis reveals two significant trends at Salem. One, the active participation of a younger generation of Moravians, especially girls and young women, in maintaining and disseminating Moravian musical repertoires, both in and importantly beyond Salem. So these young women who came from all over the place actually disseminated Moravian music traditions wherever they went. So in a way, America also became Moravian to some degree. Secondly, Bloom's research challenges the myth of American Moravian insularity. As the copybooks demonstrate persuasively, in the central domain of music, both sacred and profane, Moravians have always been cosmopolitan, innovative, and continue to remain so in a nascent United States. So their musical education program, including the copious production of copybooks, Moravians also actively shaped white middle-class American musical tastes and preferences. So it's worth considering. And the picture on the right, and I had to put it in there, David, it's a depiction of American composer Harriet Adams, surrounded by her two daughters at, I think it's a piano. And David found that the very popular ballad, which is, by the way, a romantic ballad, so that ties in with Riddick Weber. Where did those Moravian girls got their ideas to elope? Well, maybe they all sang Crazy Jane. So anyhow, it's a ballad, and Harriet Abrams became very famous putting the ballad to music, and lo and behold, David found it in the archives. So I think that's a delicious little nugget, of subversiveness. So David, your turn. How fair are we to your work?
Well, what I did in the process of cataloging the Salem manuscript book collection, I was noticing what I thought was more English language songs. Mm-hmm. Kind of a move away from both sacred music and German music to popular and English, and I was not all the way through the cataloging of it at the time of writing that paper. So statistically, I didn't come up with any proof of that. But part of that was that some of the manuscript books were not identified. So I didn't know when they were copied or by who. But it was still interesting to see the process of incorporating what was popular music at the time, mm-hmm. Not all of it American, some of it was still English, into the copybook.
And definitely cosmopolitan. And I think that is like the big takeaway point that I discovered when I was reading your research. So it's real, to me, it's very exciting to see that evidenced. Okay, thank you. Do you need a quick break? Should we all get some coffee and stretch? Would you like that? It's like, I know we worked with it for 4 years, but for all of you, it's a lot to take in. So we are still in material culture. You have probably seen them if you haven't been to Master recently, the Museum of Southern Decorative Arts, I strongly recommend to go there right now. They have an exhibition of maps. And I work very closely with them in the summer, and I just love Mesta. So these are the wonderful earthenware squirrel bottles that Moravian potters developed as part of a new way of selling their arts. And they, in particular, like to do earthenware bottles of animals that we don't have in Germany, such as turtles. So you have turtle bottles and you have the squirrel bottles. And our colleague, Jeffrey Hughes, who is an archaeologist, spent quite a bit of time investigating the kilns and that we have in Old Salem. And so he tells us a little bit more about Americanization, material culture, and the tradition of Moravian potters. In the final essay of this section on Moravian innovation, archaeologist Geoffrey Hughes begins his study by asking the provocative question, and I put it on our slide. Instead of asking how the Moravians became American, we might start by asking how Americanism became acceptably Moravian, end of quote. And this quote points out, and we have talked about it earlier today, that there are crossroads after there's a crossroad after another, right? As people move through history, every community, including the Moravians. And every crossroads offers a choice. So what we are really presenting to you are the choices that Moravian past generations made. And some choices were easier than others. And some choices, were more forced than others. And so that's where Jeff is going with his work. In reviewing archaeological remains from 2 kiln sites and aligning them with written inventories, which shifted from being written exclusively in German to bilingual texts. So this is something similar to what Dave found. You see the linguistic change happening. Hughes reframes Americanization as a layered, creative, and unpredictable entanglement process. It was messy. That generated a dynamic both and Moravian identity. Moravians became both Moravian and American. As was true for the Moravian copybooks discussed by David Bloom and Moravian architectural styles as analyzed by David Bergstone, pottery types as well expanded to include English and American styles. Moravian potters thus contributed actively to the spread of American material culture through producing new different pottery styles and adapting them to more traditional earthenware pottery, such as you see in the picture. Hughes also pays close attention to labor conditions by noting the importance of non-Moravian pottery journeymen who brought fresh ideas and designs to Salem, and the role of enslaved labor as evidenced by the life and work conditions of Brother Peter Oliver, a black enslaved potter, who was able to purchase his freedom through his work as a potter. So these innocent-looking bottles tell a profound and powerful story if you go deeper with them. And with that, we move into our final chapter and section and the discussion and where to go from here. So we are almost there and getting back to Native American themes. Next slide, please. So we have again 4 papers here. Martha Hartley, Charles Rodenboer, my colleague, Professor McAllister, and last and perhaps least, yours truly. So next slide, please.
Okay, so this section starts off with Martha Hartley. She's in the Museum and Gardens, at Salem Museum and Gardens, and she's worked tirelessly to develop the hidden Town project. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this. And I've included 3 images here that I think also function as a summary of her paper. She starts off with the beginnings of Wachovia, the first purchase of an enslaved individual, Sam. And then she goes through and shows how slavery grew in Salem, and she points out the blue dots there where they believe enslaved individuals resided, or where there were certain groups of enslaved individuals, like the Negro quarter, where they resided in Wachovia. And then the last picture there, the big one, is of the Freedmen's School that they developed outside of town next to the springs. I start off with a quote to summarize her essay, which is, "Crimes of humanity define the landscape of slavery, but the landscape of freedom is also a place of many wrongs. The legacy of slavery is persistent inequity and injustice." In her study entitled "The Changing Landscape of Slavery in Salem and Its Legacy," Martha Hartley carefully chronicles how Moravians turned enslavers and segregationists, and what this turn implied for Black generations to come. The first enslaved individual Moravians purchased was Sam, eventually baptized as Johannes Samuel. Following this initial purchase, the number of Moravian-owned enslaved individuals grew with each year. Moravians never opposed slavery out of humanitarian reasons, but they did disagree with it because of the poor example the enslaved would have on younger generations. Therefore, they strictly regulated slavery and prohibited it within the town, but increasingly permitted it outside of town limits. Even this practice eventually gave way. In 1847, Salem put a stop to all prohibitions against slave ownership, and slavery became normalized within the town limits. Hartley maps with great attention to detail how efforts to segregate the congregation corresponded to a growing demand for slave labor. Her research demonstrates that the Moravian adoption of slavery and segregation created a lasting racialized social structure that endured far into the 20th century. After emancipation, enslaved communities such as the Negro Quarter moved further outside of town, where the new communities of freedmen resided, such as Happy Hill. In the 20th century, Jim Crow laws, redlining, and other forms of urban infrastructure further entrenched the lines of segregated communities that Moravians first drew. So her piece is really crucial for understanding where we are today and why we have the neighborhoods that we have in Winston-Salem that we have today. Next slide, please. So the next one is from the historian, or local historian, Charles Rodenbaugh. And this is a picture of Greencastle in Antigua. And he looks at this curious case of a bunch of Black Moravians who had been converted in Antigua coming to North Carolina, less than 50 miles north of Salem, and the fact that Moravians never went there to minister to them, and why this happened. So historian Charles Rodenbaugh's essay, Rejection of the Baptized, Moravians and Slavery, examines a curious case of Moravian spiritual neglect and returns to a geographical focus on the British Empire's Caribbean region. In 1775, the planter Francis Farley brought a group of enslaved Black Caribbean workers from Antigua to his burgeoning tobacco plantations less than 50 miles north of Salem. What is most significant is that the group contained many people who had been baptized by Moravian missionaries on Farley's plantation in Antigua. Due to the constant flow of news from various mission settlements around the world that congregations read and discussed during their congregational meetings, the Salem community had to know, and they probably supported the evangelizing efforts in Antigua. It therefore remains a quandary why Salem Moravians failed to contact, engage, or minister to their fellow Black congregants a few miles to the north. This questionable neglect deserves scrutiny, as Moravians ministered to several communities in and surrounding Wachovia. Certainly, as Rodenbaugh suggests, the Revolutionary War created obstacles for establishing contact with the community. However, the neglect could also point to increasing boundaries perpetuated not only by the war, but also by Salem's process of increasingly looking inward and thereby becoming American. Next slide, please. The next one is my contribution to the work, and what I did is look at all of the recordings of the early morning Easter service from 1772 through 1822. And what I discovered in looking at this is that the actual event has changed very little. The things that it contains, all of the ritualistic aspects of it, largely are unchanged, which is kind of cool. So that was a surprise for me what I got in when I started looking at this. But what I did notice is that the diarist started recording the Nachbarn, the neighbors, or the visitors, the Besuchende, the strangers, as they called them, or the Fremde. They referred to them as Fremde. So anyone who was non-Moravian was considered a Fremde, or they talked about the Nachbarn coming and visiting, which would have been, who was that? Again, is this question of who the Nachbarn were. But slowly, in the 1800s, they start talking about the number of enslaved individuals or individuals of color who were attending the Easter services. And that indicated that they were starting to pay attention to color. They were starting to pay attention to race. And the question is why? So in the picture I have here, that is Herrnhut. That's God's Acre and Herrnhut with the tower in the background. It looks like that's a massive hill. I've been there. Dave, you can probably say it's really not a massive hill. It's basically flat. So I don't know, but this is like the archive, right? We're telling a narrative of how things were that aren't necessarily always true. Okay, and I start again with a little quote here, which I thought was surprising. And it reads, "The little Negro congregation wishes to hold Easter love feast services in the little Saal and also to occupy the gallery in church as guests on Maundy, Thursday communion and partake with the congregation." It's an interesting request by the new Negro congregation, the little Negro congregation as they called it. Later which was interesting, they called it the colored congregation. So they did change how they referenced this congregation, which is another interesting study that we can talk about. So my study, the Moravian Easter morning services from 1772 through 1822, Easter and the Birth of American Moravian Identity, examines the popular Easter sunrise service as a reflection of Salem's Americanization. Similar to McCullough's essay, Moravians and the Celebration of American Figures and Holidays, my study focuses on a specific holiday as a barometer of shifting social attitudes and national identity. While McCullough's essay focuses on a strictly American celebration of American independence, I focus on the uniquely Moravian performance of the early morning Easter service that began in 1732 in Herrnhut. In line with previous essays, my research also focuses on the correlation of increasing use of slave labor and segregation with an embrace of white American identity. In tracing the origins and development of the Easter sunrise service, I discovered that the diarist's attention to the event's visitors and participants reveal a subtext about the changes occurring within the community. To accommodate and eventually incorporate the values and attitudes of their surrounding non-Moravian neighbors, Moravians ended their practice of integrated worship and began to preach primarily in English. I further argue that the establishment of the Salem boarding school for girls signifies a liminal period of Americanization where the institutions of education, national identity, and language and slavery converged. By 1822, this convergence resulted in the complete segregation of the Salem congregation with the establishment of the first Black Moravian Church in America, St. Philip's. And so then I'd further go on to just explain how it's really interesting with this school. As soon as the school started, I argue that the school represents often that discourse of the nation most strongly that they want the next generation to believe. Following the school, the introduction of the school, we see segregation becoming more and more entrenched in Salem society. We have a lot more visitors coming in and visitors paying money for a certain intellectual product that they are trying to get. So that's a very interesting aspect that develops there. And eventually this leads to the segregation of God's acre. And the primary purpose is that if visitors coming to the Salem boarding school are to be buried, they don't want to be buried in a cemetery where people of color have been buried. So it's a really interesting note there. Okay.
Excellent. Thank you, Glenn. Thank you so much. So next slide, please. So my paper goes back to the very first definition of Americanization we presented to you at the beginning of our time together today, and by Marie Canova. And if you remember being washed over with so much information, that Canova said, well, the northern provinces didn't Americanize that quickly in comparison to other Europeans because of their missions. And so I wanted to know, is that true for the southern province and their missions to the Cherokee in what today is Georgia, on Cherokee homelands? And to summarize in a nutshell, I found it was really the opposite. That in the contact zone, in the Cherokee homelands at the mission, Americanization moved faster than even in Salem. And there are very, very good reasons for that. But I chose a contemporary beadwork by a highly regarded Cherokee beadworker from Oklahoma, and it shows you a very ancient motif, the water spider. And I want to point out, number one, the Cherokee Native people are still here. They still have cultural traditions that hark back to times immemorial. You also find this water spider depiction in very ancient Cherokee art. You find it on gorgets. It's everywhere. And who is the water spider? And I chose that symbol to illustrate the cross-cultural interactions that were going on at the missions, because the water spider is a symbol for how to deal with other cultures on some level. It symbolizes a lot of things, but one thing it symbolizes how, as a well-educated, mature Cherokee, you go about encountering the other. And so the story goes that at the beginning of the world making, there was no fire. And the thunder beings, through lightning, bring the fire down to the ground. And it's preserved in a hollow tree. And so, of course, the Cherokee would like some fire. Fire is very sacred to them. It has lots and lots of symbolism. But how do they get the fire? And so different animals try to get it. And the one creature that succeeds is the little water spider. Tiny, itty-bitty little thing. And what is the teaching here? Why does the water spider succeeds? So this is, when you listen to the story, you think about it. What does it try to teach? Some very, very interesting cultural philosophies and behavioral suggestions. The water spider succeeds because it is one of the few creatures who can be in different dimensions. It can be on the water, but it can also dive down. It can move in different culture zones, if you wish. It can move and come back and go back and forth between different groups of people, between different cultures. Then, unlike the other animals, the spider thinks before it acts. The other animals get burned by contact with fire. The spider says, hey, I have a plan. I make myself a little bowl, and it pulls out some thread out of its, wherever it comes out, tummy, I think, and makes a little bowl and prepares itself and takes not everything, but just a little bit. And with that bowl, it crosses cultures, takes what it needs, and then it brings that back home. So you prepare, you don't take everything, you just take a little bit, just what you need, and then you bring it back. And to remind people of that principle, even to this day, the water spider has a little bowl of its back. So it's a very, very profound, very powerful image, a symbol, a metaphor for how to go about cross-cultural connection. Now, the Moravians had their eyes on the Cherokee missions ever since Spangenberg. Spangenberg talks about this. Succeed getting permission by the Cherokee Nation, and then at Spring Place build their mission station. They have enslaved people work for them. They bring enslaved woman Pleasant, who is commemorized in the St. Philip's Museum. You have a sculpture there, imagining what she might have looked like. And the culture wars continue. The Moravians are super uncomfortable with traditional Black African religious and spiritual and cultural traditions on the plantation, and where they live is adjacent to the Van plantation. Van is one of the largest slave owners in the area, hundreds of slave families, and they're also very, very uncomfortable with traditional Cherokee customs and traditions. They never learn the language. I could talk a lot about that. I won't. In any case, I have a quote for you. And so the Moravians, in one of their missives to Salem, say, "Satan is being served very diligently in our neighborhood. Almost all Saturday nights are spent in dancing by Negroes and Indians. And Sundays are used for ball games and other things of the kind." Don't like it. Don't like it. And it really shows like a continuity with Winnell Curtin Roberts' work. You know, I mean, it just freaked them out, to use a very vernacular kind of non-scholarly way of summarizing this. And so they had this ongoing struggle of aligning themselves with these. And they were really, really happy when they could go and do their Singstunde and kind of recuperate with a really slow and calm and non-drumming Moravian music. So that's as a context. So this is like the last, we are almost done. In my study at the Moravian missions in Spring Place and Uskaloga, I resume Winnell Curtin Roberts' theme of Moravian missions and cross-cultural communication with an emphasis on Cherokee and Black views of Moravians as well. Moravian missionaries to the Cherokee Nation worked at the very periphery of Southern Moravian influence and were entirely dependent, and this is now the key point, on the goodwill of U.S. government agents and the Cherokee Nation. They had no choice but to accommodate the divergent interests of both. Adding to the cross-cultural and political challenges, a large surrounding Black community of enslaved workers had already established a viable cultural and religious life of its own and was much less dependent on the missionaries as they had initially hoped. To become Moravian American in this multi-perspectival and multilingual contact zone translated into the Moravian pursuit of so-called civilization programs for the U.S. government. English education for their Cherokee hosts in their modest boarding schools, and here we have the theme of schools again, and a tenuous alignment with the Cherokee planter class against the best interests of enslaved Black people. So it was a very charged triangulation of interests here. In this context, gender played an important role in that the Moravian enslaved mission worker, Pleasant, who died and is buried here, appears as a persistently vocal critic of Moravian hypocrisy, and she never converted, and white Moravian missionary Anna Rosina Gambold had some success in collaborating with wealthy Cherokee women who constituted the majority of Cherokee converts. So they are like really, really fascinating gender through lines in our work that we all could study more and more deeply. So in conclusion, by 1772, Wachovia-born Moravians were moving further away from the Zinzendorf-Spangenberg dream as they found themselves in an increasingly American contact zones where economic necessity and political circumstance challenged earlier conventions and convictions. In line with the new nation's citizen ethos, the European-born aristocratic hierarchy of Moravian leadership gave way to a resourceful class of artisans and merchants living on appropriated Indian land and depending on black labor. Innovative and enterprising, Southern white Moravians succeeded in finding white acceptance and individual freedom. But as the contemporary national movements of Black Lives Matter, No Dapple, and Me Too demonstrate, however, the country that they sought to make their own and that they saw themselves as belonging to has far from completed its journey towards the promise of justice and liberty for all. Thank you.
Could we go forward a couple of slides, please? One more. To conclude today's talk, and then we'll go into another discussion or question and answer section. We're really interested in continuing our discussions here and our examination of Moravians in America. And we are interested in a new 50-year period, starting with 1822 and going up through 1877. So including this period, the antebellum period, and then going up through the period of Reconstruction, which ends in 1877. My colleague talked about a process of Americanization involving this question of citizenship. And I think it's really interesting that citizenship up until the Civil War did not include people of color. There is the famous Dred Scott decision, Supreme Court decision in 1857 that deemed that people of color were not included in the Constitution. The Constitution was never meant to include American citizenship for people of Black African descent, regardless of whether or not they were free or enslaved. That's a huge exclamation point as to what it meant to be an American at this time. So during Reconstruction, one of the first Reconstruction amendments following the 13th Amendment, banning slavery, was the 14th Amendment, which guaranteed citizenship by birth. So birthright citizenship. That immediately gave more than 4 million people, formerly enslaved, people of color, citizenship. So it would be interesting to see how this impacted Moravians. What was happening in Salem at this time? What was going on here? And the 15th Amendment, the last amendment during the Reconstruction period, was that states could not refuse one to vote. The whole importance of voting and how that is all entangled in this question of what it means to be an American, what is a real American, and how do we continue this democratic process, which is one of the 3 big components of being American democracy.